I am 78 years old, and I have spent most of my life fixing things that were never meant to last forever. I've replaced water heaters that failed in the middle of winter, rebuilt a roof after a storm tore it apart like paper, swapped out 3 car engines that gave up without warning, and once even tore out an entire kitchen floor because the foundation underneath had shifted just enough to make everything above it useless. That is what I understand. Systems. Weight. Pressure. Failure points. What I did not understand, what I never calculated for, was my own body becoming the next broken structure on that list. The surgeon, Dr. Leonard, a young man with calm eyes and a voice that never rose above certainty, told me my hip replacement was routine. He said it the way people say easy job when they've never had to live through it. At 78, nothing about being opened up and rebuilt feels routine. But I nodded anyway. I always nod. I have been nodding politely for most of my life. It's a habit you develop when you're the kind of man who listens more than he speaks, and it rarely changes anything in your favor. My name is Albert Walker. I spent 40 years as an engineer. I've designed structures meant to carry weight far beyond what people imagine when they walk across them. Bridges. Systems. Load-bearing frameworks that hold up entire lives without anyone thinking twice. And yet, somehow, I never applied any of that knowledge to the people closest to me. I told my 3 children about the surgery exactly 6 weeks in advance. Not a vague soon, not a sometime next month. 6 full weeks. 42 days. A number long enough to do something meaningful with, if you cared enough to try. Raymond is my eldest. 49 years old. He called me one Tuesday evening while I was sitting in my kitchen. I could hear the television in the background and the faint rhythm of him doing something else while talking to me, scrolling, maybe, or flipping through channels, or both. He said, "Don't worry, Dad. We'll all be there." There was a pause after that, the kind that tells you the conversation has already moved on in his mind. Then he asked about the property on Sycamore Lane. Not my health. Not the operation. The property. Bella, my second, sent me a voice message. 4 minutes and 22 seconds long. I know because I counted. Then I counted again. She started with apologies. So many of them that they stopped sounding like words and started sounding like filler between thoughts she didn't want to have. Work was impossible. Her husband was busy. The kids had something going on. She would try her best. She would figure something out. She would, of course, Dad. That phrase, of course, Dad, showed up 4 times. I replayed it 3 times, not because it meant anything, but because I kept expecting it to eventually turn into something that did. It never did. And then there was Nora. Nora called 3 weeks before the surgery. I remember the exact afternoon because I was making a sandwich in my kitchen when her name appeared on the screen. For a second, I felt something like warmth. A reflex. Not hope exactly. Something older than that. She asked me how I felt about the surgery. I told her the truth. That I was nervous, but ready. There was a pause on her end. I've learned over the years that Nora's pauses always mean something is coming, but it's rarely what you hope it will be. Then she said she was in a bit of a situation. Her rent was short. She didn't ask directly at first. She never does. She circles it like it's something delicate that might break if held too firmly. But I knew where it was going before she finished the sentence. I transferred the money while she was still on the phone. She thanked me quickly. Almost lightly. Said she'd pay me back. Said she'd call later. She didn't call later. She didn't call the next day either. And once the money left my account, so did the conversation. I didn't think much of it at the time. Or at least I told myself I didn't. But the mind has a way of storing things even when you pretend not to notice them. The morning of my surgery, I woke up at 5:15. The house was quiet in that specific way large houses become quiet when they belong to only one person. Not peaceful. Not comforting. Just empty in a structured, echoing way. I made coffee I wasn't allowed to drink. I sat by the window instead. Outside, Kentucky was just starting to turn gold, the early light spreading slowly across the trees, softening everything it touched. And I thought, very clearly, if something goes wrong today, the last real interaction I had with my youngest daughter was her asking me for money. That thought didn't come with emotion at first. Just clarity. Then it stayed longer than I wanted it to. I left for the hospital shortly after. The check-in process was efficient, almost too efficient, like I was just another item on a list that had been completed many times before. A nurse named Gloria took my phone before surgery. She had kind eyes and the steady hands of someone who has done this job long enough to stop rushing. I remember thinking she looked like the only person in the building who wasn't pretending anything was simple. Then there was nothing for a while. And then there was pain. Not all at once, but in layers. The kind that arrives slowly enough for you to understand it is settling in permanently. Hip replacement recovery is not routine. It is a negotiation between your body and every movement you've ever taken for granted. There were nights when the pain woke me before I was fully asleep. Nights when the room felt too bright even in darkness. Nights when I learned the exact difference between being alone and being unattended. There is a special kind of loneliness in hospitals. It isn't the absence of people. It is the presence of everything except the one person you want to see. I had a blue vinyl chair beside my bed. It was slightly uneven, tilted just enough that anyone sitting in it would lean subtly left. That chair became something I watched more than the ceiling. It stayed empty. Raymond called on day 2. Asked how I was feeling. On day 5, he suggested I organize my financial documents. Said it casually, like it was just helpful advice. Bella called more frequently, but each call was a variation of the same thing, reasons she couldn't come and promises that she would. Traffic. Work. Kids. A stomach issue that changed its diagnosis mid-conversation. On day 7, she said she would definitely come on day 9. On day 9, she didn't come. She texted instead. Something came up. I'll explain later. Love you. I read that message twice. Then I put the phone down and looked at the empty chair. That was the moment something shifted. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Quietly. Like a structure settling after stress testing. Nora did not call at all. Not once. Not before surgery. Not during. Not after. On the 7th day in the hospital, a nurse came in to check my vitals. She noticed the empty chair and asked, gently, if I had family. I told her yes. I smiled when I said it. Even I knew how meaningless that sounded. When I was discharged on day 13, I left the hospital in a wheelchair because that's policy, not because I needed it at that point. A volunteer wheeled me to the entrance. I remember thinking how strange it was that a system could insist on helping you only at the very end, when everything difficult had already been done alone. Outside, I ordered an Uber.
The driver didn't say much, just helped me to the door when we arrived, and then I stood there for a moment. Not because I couldn't go inside, but because I suddenly understood something about the place I was about to enter. A house doesn't change when you leave it for 13 days, but it tells you something when no one comes to check on it. Inside, everything was exactly where I left it. That was the problem. The untouched mail, the silent kitchen, the absence of small, meaningless signs that someone had been there, even a plant that hadn't been watered. Nothing dramatic, just absence, arranged neatly across every surface. I made tea. I moved slowly through my own kitchen like I was learning it again. And I thought about that blue chair again. Not as furniture, as evidence. Later that evening, I called Michael Simmons, my attorney. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I simply explained what I needed. He listened without interrupting. That's what I've always liked about him. He understands that silence is part of the information. When I finished, he asked only one question. Are you certain? So I told him I had been certain since day 7. That was the truth. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't nodding politely anymore. The house on Sycamore Lane has always been the kind of place that remembers everything, even when nobody else does. I noticed that the first night I came back from the hospital, it wasn't anything dramatic. No broken windows, no obvious sign of intrusion or neglect. In fact, that was the point. Everything was exactly as I had left it. Too exactly. A house, when it's lived in, changes by degrees you don't notice until you leave it alone long enough to see the difference. A chair gets pushed slightly off alignment. A glass is left drying near the sink. A blanket folds itself differently, depending on who last used it. But mine was untouched. The mail was stacked neatly in the same position I left it. The kitchen counter had no new marks, no stray receipts, no forgotten grocery bags. Even the air felt paused, as if the house had been holding its breath while I was gone. 13 days, not a single visitor. I stood in the kitchen for a long time that first evening. My hip was still adjusting to the idea that it belonged to me again. Every step sent a quiet reminder through my body that things had been taken apart and rebuilt, whether I agreed with it or not. I filled the kettle slowly. I didn't rush it, there was no reason to. When it whistled, I poured myself tea and stood by the window looking out at the backyard. The rose bushes were still there along the south fence. I planted them in 1995. I remember because Bella was still in high school then, and she complained that roses were old man flowers, which I suppose they are in a way, but they survived every winter since. Unlike some things, I sat down at the kitchen table and tried to organize my thoughts the way I used to organize structural plans. Identify the load, identify the stress points, identify where failure began. The problem was that people don't behave like beams or bridges. They don't fail at predictable points. They fail where you least expect them to. My phone sat on the table beside me, silent, no missed calls, no new messages from the hospital, no follow-up from any of them. I didn't expect anything anymore. Expectation is something you learn to turn off when it stops paying dividends, but I still looked at it once or twice, as if it might change its mind. It didn't. The next morning I woke early again. Old habits don't reset just because your body has been repaired. The hip surgery had done its job, mechanically speaking. Dr. Leonard was right about one thing, it worked. Pain was now manageable. Movement was possible again, slow but functional. But function is not the same as comfort. I made coffee and sat in my chair by the window. That chair has been mine for decades. It knows my shape better than most people do. The right armrest is worn down where my elbow always lands. The fabric has faded in a way that only happens when sunlight hits the same place for too many years. I sat there and thought about the hospital chair. Blue vinyl, slight tilt to the left, always empty. It is strange how a piece of furniture can become more honest than people. That chair never lied. It never promised to come and then didn't. It never said of course when it meant maybe. It just stayed there, doing its job, waiting. Raymond called on the second day after I returned home. He always calls in a way that suggests timing is important, like he has scheduled the call between other, more urgent responsibilities. "Hey, Dad," he said, "how are you feeling?" There was a pause after that. Not a listening pause, a waiting for his turn pause. I told him I was recovering. "Good, good," he said quickly. "That's good to hear." Then almost immediately he shifted. "So I was thinking about your documents. Financial stuff, you've got everything organized, right?" I looked at the stack of perfectly labeled folders in my study. Every contract, every investment record, every insurance policy, arranged with the precision of a man who spent his life making sure nothing failed due to confusion. "Yes," I said. "Great," he replied. "Just thinking ahead, you know, no rush or anything." No rush. That phrase always interests me. People use it when they want urgency without accountability. We talked for a few more minutes. He asked how the hip was. I gave him the correct answer. He told me to rest. Then he said he'd call again soon. He didn't ask when I last had company. Bella called more often. If you measure frequency alone, you might even call it care. But care is not frequency. Care is presence. Her calls came in bursts. Sometimes 2 in a day, sometimes none for 2. Each one had a similar structure. Apology, explanation, promise. Apology, explanation, promise. The explanations were always detailed enough to sound real, but never stable enough to hold weight. A child's schedule, a husband's work, a sudden illness that appeared and disappeared like weather. On day 5, she said she was trying to arrange something. On day 7, She said she absolutely would come on day 9. On day 9, she didn't come. Instead, she sent a text. "Dad, I'm really sorry. Something urgent came up. I'll explain soon. Love you." I read it once. Then again. The words didn't change the second time. I set the phone down on the kitchen table and looked out the window. The rosebushes didn't care. They never do. Nora remained absent in a different way. Not physically absent, not occasionally absent. Completely absent. No calls, no messages, no check-ins, nothing. It is a particular kind of silence when someone who knows you well decides not to participate in your life for a period of time. It isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It just removes a thread from the structure and waits to see if anything collapses. I did not collapse, but I did notice. On the 7th day after I returned home, a nurse named Gloria called the hospital to check on me. I didn't ask her to. She did it on her own. She said she just wanted to make sure I was doing all right. I told her I was. There was a pause on her end, the kind people use when they are deciding whether to say something honest. Then she asked carefully, "Do you have family nearby, Mr. Walker?" I looked out at my kitchen, at the empty chair across from me. "Yes," I said. I said it without hesitation, because technically it was true. They existed. That was the extent of it. After I hung up, I sat there for a long time thinking about how easily words can carry meanings that are no longer attached to reality. Family, support, presence, all of them still technically valid, none of them functionally true. By day 10, I stopped expecting calls in any meaningful way. Expectation, I realized, is just delayed disappointment with better branding. On day 13, I was discharged. The hospital process was efficient, almost industrial. Forms signed, instructions given, medication explained in careful, rehearsed language. Dr. Leonard stopped by briefly. He shook my hand and told me I had recovered well. "Take it slow," he said. I nodded. Of course I nodded. I always do. A volunteer brought the wheelchair. It is policy, apparently, to wheel patients out even when they are capable of walking, a symbolic reversal of independence. I found that mildly amusing. Outside, the air felt sharper than I remembered. I ordered an Uber. The driver was young, polite, quiet, the kind of person who knows when not to talk. He helped me to the door when we arrived at Sycamore Lane. I thanked him. He nodded. And then I stood in front of my house, not because I needed to rest, but because I needed to understand what I was about to walk back into. The front door was unchanged. Same brass handle. Same slight imperfection in the wood panel I had once planned to fix and never did. I placed my hand on it, and for a moment I didn't open it, because something about returning to a place that has not changed in your absence can feel like proof of something you weren't ready to confirm. Then I opened it. Inside, everything was exactly as I had left it. The silence was not new. It was continued. And somehow that made it heavier. I set my bag down in the hallway. The house did not greet me. It never has. But this time I noticed it more clearly. I walked slowly into the kitchen. The kettle was still where I left it, the sink empty, the surfaces clean in a way that meant untouched, not maintained. I checked the small things without meaning to. The plant by the window unwatered, the mail undisturbed, the chair empty, always empty. I made tea anyway, because routine is something the body remembers, even when the mind is reconsidering everything else. I carried the cup to my chair by the window and sat down. That chair has supported me for 30 years. It did not change in my absence either. That, I suppose, is what loyalty looks like when it is not performed. I thought about calling someone. Not because I needed help, but because I wanted to test something. The phone sat on the table beside me. I did not pick it up. Instead, I looked out at the yard, at the rose bushes, at the fence line, at the world continuing exactly as it should. And I understood very clearly that something in my life had already been restructured. Not dramatically, not loudly, but permanently. And I had been the one to draw the lines. I did not make the decision in anger. That is something people often assume when they hear what I did next. They imagine a moment of rage, some dramatic breaking point where everything snaps at once. But that isn't how structures fail when they are designed properly. They don't explode. They adjust, they shift. They settle into a new configuration that makes more sense under the load they've been given. That is what I did. I adjusted. Michael Simmons came to my house 2 days after I called him. He arrived exactly on time, which is one of the reasons I've trusted him for 26 years. Engineers respect punctuality the same way doctors respect clean instruments. It tells you something about how seriously someone treats unseen details. He didn't ask unnecessary questions when he walked in. He never does. He just placed his briefcase on my kitchen table, looked at me for a moment and said, "All right, Albert, talk to me." So I did. I told him everything the way I experienced it. Not emotionally, not dramatically, just factually. 13 days in the hospital. 3 children informed 6 weeks in advance. 1 empty chair that stayed empty every day. 1 voice message, 1 promise, 1 silence. When I finished, Michael didn't interrupt immediately. He just leaned back slightly in his chair, folded his hands, and looked at the table like he was calculating something that didn't belong in numbers. Then he said, "Are you sure you want to do something permanent based on this?" That word permanent always interests me, because everything meaningful is permanent in one way or another. Even absence becomes permanent if it is consistent enough. "I'm not reacting," I said. "I've already reacted. I'm responding now." He nodded slowly. That was enough for him. We spent the next hour going through details. Not emotional ones, structural ones. Assets, property, beneficiaries, charitable allocations, legal phrasing that would hold under scrutiny, the architecture of consequences. Michael never once tried to steer me away from it. That's another reason I chose him. Some lawyers try to be moral advisors. Michael understands his job is to translate decisions into enforceable reality, not to debate their origin. When he left, the sun was already lowering outside my kitchen window. The light in this house always changes slowly in the evening, as if even time respects the walls here. I sat alone for a while after he left, not thinking about whether I had done the right thing. That question didn't feel relevant anymore. I was thinking about load distribution, about what happens when weight is no longer shared equally across a structure. Over the next few weeks, something changed in how I experienced time. It didn't speed up or slow down. It became more deliberate. I stopped waiting for calls that would not arrive. That sounds simple, but it isn't. Waiting is not just an action, it is a habit, and habits do not disappear just because they become irrational. Raymond called on Sunday morning at exactly 10. He always calls at 10 now. It is impressive, in a way, how quickly people can adapt when they believe something might be at stake. "Hey, Dad," he said, "how are you feeling?" "Better," I said. "That's great, really good to hear." Pause. Then the shift. "So I was looking at property values again in your area. Things are moving up, actually, pretty significantly." There it was again. The careful transition, health to housing, concern to interest. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I let the silence exist long enough for him to notice it. But Raymond is good at filling silence. He continued talking about market trends, interest rates, long-term value projections. He sounded prepared, practiced, as if he had rehearsed this version of concern in advance, just in case the conversation reached this exact point. When he finally stopped, I said, "You've been doing your homework." He laughed lightly. "Just trying to stay informed, Dad." "Of course," I said. That phrase, of course, has become my way of acknowledging patterns without endorsing them. We ended the call shortly after. Bella came on Thursday. She brought groceries. Not random ones, specific ones. The kind I actually use. Coffee I prefer. Bread I buy. Small, careful selections that suggest observation has replaced absence. She was smiling when she arrived. Too quickly, too consistently. The kind of smile that arrives before emotion does, like it has been instructed to appear regardless of internal conditions. "Hi, Dad," she said brightly. "I thought I'd help out a bit." She moved around my kitchen like someone trying to prove familiarity through motion, putting things away, opening cabinets she already knew, commenting on small details she didn't need to comment on. "This pantry is so organized," she said at one point. "Yes," I replied, "it always has been." She paused for a second, then laughed lightly as if I had made a joke. I hadn't. We sat down afterward. She talked about her children, her husband, school schedules, work pressures. Everything was arranged carefully to avoid silence. At one point, she reached across the table and touched my hand. "I've been meaning to say," she began, then stopped. I waited. She restarted. I'm really sorry I didn't come to the hospital. There it was, finally. Not fully formed, but close enough. I nodded. I know, I said. That was all. She looked relieved by my response, which interested me more than the apology itself. Relief is often mistaken for resolution. It is not the same thing. She stayed for an hour. When she left, she hugged me longer than usual, as if duration could replace absence. Nora was different. Nora always is. Her presence did not increase. It evolved. First it was a text, short, uncertain, almost testing the surface. Hey, Dad, how are you feeling? Then another a few days later. Cold out today, stay warm. Then a photograph, a sunset, no words attached. I studied that one longer than I expected to. Not because of sentiment, because of timing. People send images when they want to be seen without being responsible for conversation. It is communication without obligation. I responded politely every time. Full sentences, proper punctuation, no emotion excess, no emotional debt. I did not punish them with silence. I did not reward them with reassurance. I simply matched their effort precisely. That too is engineering. Balance without escalation. By the time March arrived, something had shifted in how they interacted with me. Not dramatically, not obviously, but consistently. Raymond's calls became more structured. Always 10 o'clock, always prepared. Always ending with subtle financial inquiries that were framed as concern. Bella's visits became more frequent. Thursdays became expected. Groceries became habitual. Conversation became smoother, less defensive, more practiced. Nora's messages became slightly more personal. She asked questions now, small ones, about my past, about my work, about things she had never shown interest in before. What exactly did you build again? I didn't know you worked on bridges. Did you ever like your job? Simple questions. The questions require attention. And attention, once given, creates a kind of presence even when physical presence is missing. One Saturday morning I stood outside in the garden. The rose bushes were still bare at that time, but I knew what they would become. They always returned, reliable in a way people rarely are. I noticed my hip then, not the pain, the absence of pain, or rather the absence of limitation. Dr. Leonard had been right about the mechanics. He just hadn't accounted for the rest of it. I walked slowly along the fence line. The house behind me was quiet. Not empty, just observant. Michael called that afternoon. He confirmed everything was in place. Documents prepared, instructions finalized, trust structures aligned, charitable distributions established. All we need now, he said, is time. I told him we already had it, because I understood something by then. Time is not what passes. Time is what accumulates in absence. That evening, Raymond called again. Same time, same tone. How are you feeling, Dad? Good, I said. That's great. Pause. Then carefully. I was thinking maybe we should do a family dinner soon, just all of us. It's been a while. There it was again, the reconstruction attempt. Repair initiated after evaluation. I think that would be fine, I said. And I meant it, because I was no longer interested in preventing them from showing up. I was only interested in seeing what showing up actually meant. After I hung up, I sat in my chair by the window, the same chair that had held me through every version of my life. Outside the light was fading. Inside everything was prepared. Not for conflict, not for reconciliation, but for confirmation. And for the first time since the hospital, I felt no need to explain anything to anyone. The structure had already spoken, and now it was simply waiting for the final load. The family dinner was set for a Saturday evening. Raymond arrived first, of course. That was his pattern now. He believed consistency proved reliability, and in a way he wasn't entirely wrong. He stepped into the house with a practiced ease, carrying a bottle of wine and the expression of a man trying to make an impression on something he still considered stable. Good to see you, Dad, he said. I nodded. You too. Bella arrived next, slightly late but not enough to comment on. She brought dessert again, something store-bought but carefully selected to look thoughtful. She hugged me longer than necessary, as if holding on could correct timing. Nora came last. She always does. She didn't announce herself this time. No call from the driveway, no soft performance of arrival. She just stepped in, looked around and said, "Hey, Dad," like she was trying on a version of herself she wasn't fully used to yet. We sat at the table I had set carefully. The same table I had used for decades, the same wood, the same placement, the same quiet authority it always had. For a while the conversation stayed safe. Work, weather, children. Small updates designed to avoid anything sharp. I watched them the way I once watched stress tests in my engineering days. Not emotionally, structurally. Where does pressure increase? Where does it redistribute? Where does it leak? Raymond talked most at first. Bella laughed at the right places. Nora stayed quieter than usual, but more present than she had ever been. And then, eventually, there was a pause. Not accidental. The kind that always comes when people sense there is something still sitting underneath the surface of the room. Raymond cleared his throat. "Dad," he said carefully, "about the house and the future planning you mentioned before." Bella glanced down at her plate. Nora didn't move. I set my fork down. It was not dramatic, it was not intended to be. Just final in a quiet way. "I had surgery," I said simply. "I told you all 6 weeks in advance." Silence followed, but I continued. "I spent 13 days in a hospital bed. I came home alone, I left the same way. No one interrupted. They didn't need to. I watched an empty chair every day," I said. "I listened to calls that didn't happen. I read messages that explained absence instead of correcting it." Bella shifted slightly. Raymond looked down. Nora's eyes stayed fixed on me. "I am not telling you this for apology," I continued. "I stopped needing that some time ago." The room tightened. Not emotionally, structurally. Like a frame realizing the weight has already been redistributed elsewhere. "I made decisions during that time," I said, carefully, "the same way I built everything else in my life." Raymond's voice came softer now. "Dad, we didn't realize it was that serious." I nodded once. "That," I said, "is exactly the point." No one spoke after that for a moment. Then I stood up. Slowly, no rush. My hip held steady. Dr. Leonard had done good work. I walked to the sideboard and picked up a small envelope. "I wrote something for you," I said. Bella tensed slightly. Nora leaned forward just a fraction. I placed the envelope on the table, not sliding it, not pushing it toward anyone in particular, just placing it like a final measurement. "It explains everything you need to understand," I said. "Not emotionally, structurally." Raymond didn't touch it yet. Bella looked like she wanted to but didn't. Nora reached it first. She opened it. I watched her read. Her expression changed slowly, not all at once, first confusion, then recognition, then something quieter, something that didn't have a clean name. Inside was the updated structure of everything I had built over the last months. The will, the trusts, the allocations, the final design. Not anger, just consequence. Bella whispered, "Dad." I raised my hand slightly, not to stop her, just to pause what wasn't necessary. "I still love you," I said. That part never changed. But love, I added, is not the same as access. Silence again, different this time. Heavier, final. I sat back down slowly. Outside, through the window, the rose bushes moved slightly in the wind. The same ones that had survived everything I planted them through. Raymond finally spoke, but his voice was different now, smaller. "Can we fix this?" I looked at him for a long moment, and I thought about bridges I had designed that could carry weight, but only if the load was placed correctly from the beginning. "You already did," I said quietly. Nora didn't cry. Bella did. Raymond didn't move. And I did not repeat myself, because repetition is for things that can still be changed. I stood up once more, not leaving them, just concluding the meeting. The way engineers conclude a final inspection, not with emotion but with confirmation. I walked back toward the hallway. Behind me I heard the envelope open further, paper shifting, silence settling into its final form. And for the first time in a long time I felt no tension in my chest. Not victory, not revenge, just completion. Outside the wind moved through the rose bushes again, and the house on Sycamore Lane remained exactly as it had always been. Well built, carefully maintained, and finally understood.